I'm standing in the corner of the Riverbend Estate's grand ballroom, champagne flute trembling in my hand, watching my sister Vanessa glide across the marble floor in her $8,000 gown. The string quartet is playing something elegant and forgettable. 200 guests are mingling under crystal chandeliers that cost more than my rent for a year. And I'm about to witness the moment when everything Vanessa built comes crashing down, because she couldn't resist one final jab at the sister she's spent a lifetime diminishing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But here's the thing nobody saw coming, least of all Vanessa, the woman she chose to humiliate me in front of. She wasn't just any wedding guest. She was the client who controlled Vanessa's entire career. And what my sister didn't know, what she couldn't have known because she never bothered to ask, is that I wasn't actually the failure she'd been telling everyone I was. Sometimes the people who underestimate you the loudest are the ones who fall the hardest. 3 weeks before the wedding, I was sitting in the cramped breakfast nook of our childhood home in Ashwood Hills, watching rain streak down the window while my father pushed scrambled eggs around his plate. Gordon Bennett had always been a man of few words, the kind who believed that silence spoke louder than lectures. He looked at me over his reading glasses, the ones he refused to admit he needed, and said quietly, "Vanessa's been telling people you're going through a rough patch." The understatement made me laugh, sharp and bitter. A rough patch. That's what we were calling it. 6 months ago, I'd walked away from a 6-figure position at a Denver data science firm after my supervisor took credit for my machine learning algorithm and presented it to investors as his own work. When I threatened to expose him, he launched a whisper campaign that painted me as unstable, difficult, a woman who couldn't handle the pressure of a competitive environment. By the time I left, my reputation in Colorado's tech scene was scorched earth. I came home to Ashwood Hills with my belongings in the back of a Honda Civic, no job lined up, and a LinkedIn profile I was too afraid to update because I didn't know how to explain the gap without sounding defensive. Vanessa's response when I showed up at the family house? She'd wrinkled her nose like I'd brought something unpleasant in on my shoes and said, "Well, at least you can help with the wedding planning since you've got all this free time now." That was 10 weeks ago. Since then, I'd been the unpaid labor behind her perfect day. Addressing invitations in calligraphy because the professional service was too expensive. Calling vendors to negotiate discounts Vanessa would later claim she'd secured through her business connections. Picking up her dress for the final fitting because she had a client meeting she couldn't miss. Every task came with a reminder that she was doing me a favor by keeping me busy, by giving my empty days structure and purpose. What Vanessa didn't know, what I hadn't told anyone except my father in a late-night conversation over herbal tea and exhaustion, was that I'd been working. Not job hunting in the traditional sense, but building something. For the past 2 months, I'd been developing a proprietary analytics platform designed specifically for mid-sized companies that couldn't afford enterprise-level solutions. The code was elegant, the interface intuitive, and the beta testing results were promising enough that 3 companies had already expressed interest in pilot programs. I was working 16-hour days in the converted garden shed behind our father's house, surviving on coffee and the stubborn refusal to let my former supervisor's sabotage define the rest of my career. But I kept it quiet. Partly because I didn't want to jinx it, partly because I was tired of explaining myself, and partly because there was something satisfying about being underestimated. People revealed their true nature when they thought you had nothing to offer them. The wedding invitation had arrived with a handwritten note from Vanessa. "Hope you can make it, Claire. I know things have been difficult for you, but it would mean a lot to have family there. Don't worry about a +1, I'm sure you're not seeing anyone right now anyway." The casual cruelty was so perfectly Vanessa that I almost admired it. She had a gift for phrasing insults as concern, for making you feel small while pretending to lift you up. Our mother had been the same way before she passed, always comparing us, always making sure I knew that Vanessa was the successful one, the pretty one, the daughter who made her proud. I'd learned early that nothing I accomplished would ever quite measure up, so eventually I stopped trying to impress them and started working for myself. The day of the wedding arrived with unseasonably warm October weather, the kind of golden afternoon that wedding photographers dream about. The Riverbend estate sat on a bluff overlooking the Willamette River, all manicured gardens and architectural drama. Vanessa had chosen it because it photographed well, because it sent a message about her status, because everything Vanessa did was calculated to project an image of effortless success. I arrived early, as instructed, to help with last-minute emergencies. My role was clear: be useful, stay invisible, don't outshine the bride. I wore a simple navy dress I'd owned for years, minimal jewelry, flat shoes that wouldn't draw attention. Vanessa had specifically requested I not wear heels because she didn't want me towering over her in photos. The ceremony was beautiful in that generic, Pinterest-perfect way that all expensive weddings are. Vanessa floated down the aisle on our father's arm while I sat in the third row, watching Howard Reeves beam at his bride with the uncomplicated happiness of a man who'd never had to question whether he was loved for himself or for what he represented. Howard was fine. Pleasant, successful in a middle management sort of way, the kind of man who would never surprise you but would also never disappoint you. He worked in commercial real estate and talked enthusiastically about cap rates and market cycles. Vanessa had chosen him the way she chose everything else, carefully, strategically, checking all the boxes on her list of requirements for a suitable husband. The reception began with cocktails on the terrace. I found a spot near the stone balustrade, far enough from the main crowd that I could observe without participating. The guest list was heavy on Vanessa's professional contacts, people from the marketing world who spoke in acronyms and buzzwords, who laughed too loudly at mediocre jokes and constantly checked their phones. I recognized a few faces from the agency where Vanessa worked, polished professionals who'd mastered the art of seeming interested while mentally composing their next Instagram caption. And then I saw her. Patricia Caldwell stood near the bar, a striking woman in her mid-50s with silver hair cut in a sharp bob and the kind of posture that suggested decades of corporate boardrooms. She wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my car, and she had the unmistakable air of someone who was used to being the most important person in any room. I knew who she was because Vanessa had been obsessing over her attendance for weeks. Patricia Caldwell was the founder and CEO of Caldwell & Associates, a rapidly growing tech company that specialized in data infrastructure for healthcare systems. More importantly, she was Vanessa's biggest client, the account that represented nearly 40% of her agency's revenue. Landing Caldwell & Associates had been Vanessa's major career triumph, the achievement she mentioned in every conversation, the proof that she belonged in the upper echelons of Portland's business community. She'd invited Patricia to the wedding as a gesture of respect, never expecting she'd actually attend. But here she was, nursing a gin and tonic and looking mildly uncomfortable in the sea of younger, louder guests. I watched Vanessa spot Patricia and immediately shift into professional mode, her wedding day glow taking on a sharper, more calculated edge. She glided over with Howard in tow, all gracious smiles and practiced charm. I was too far away to hear the conversation, but I could read the body language. Vanessa was performing, gesturing animatedly, laughing at whatever Patricia said with just the right degree of enthusiasm. And then, inevitably, Vanessa's gaze swept across the terrace and landed on me. I saw the decision form in real time, the slight narrowing of her eyes, the microscopic shift in her expression. She was going to introduce us. Not out of sisterly affection, but because she'd spotted an opportunity to elevate herself by contrast. Vanessa beckoned me over with a wave that looked casual but felt like a command. I set down my champagne and crossed the terrace, every step feeling like walking toward a trap I couldn't avoid. Up close, Patricia Caldwell was even more formidable, with gray eyes that assessed and catalogued everything they saw. Vanessa slipped her arm through mine in a gesture that might have looked affectionate to observers but felt more like a restraint. Her smile was perfect, her voice warm and slightly pitying as she said, "Patricia, I'd like you to meet my little sister, Claire. She's been staying with our father for a while now. Claire's going through a bit of a career transition." The emphasis on transition was subtle but unmistakable, a polite euphemism that everyone understood meant something less polite. Patricia extended her hand and I shook it, her grip firm and professional. Before I could say anything, Vanessa continued, her tone still light and affectionate but with an edge that cut deep if you knew where to listen. "Claire used to work in tech out in Denver, but things didn't quite work out. You know how it is, sometimes people just aren't built for that kind of pressure. She's been taking some time to figure out her next steps." She patted my arm in what was meant to look like sisterly support. "It's actually been good for her to slow down, help out with the wedding planning. Kept her busy, gave her something to focus on besides, well, you know. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Vanessa had just told one of the most powerful women in Portland's tech scene that I was unemployed, aimless, and probably a little fragile. That I needed to be kept busy with menial tasks because I couldn't handle real work. That my career had imploded due to some personal failing. And she'd done it with a smile, at her own wedding, in front of a woman whose respect she desperately needed. I felt the familiar flush of humiliation creep up my neck, the same feeling I'd experienced countless times growing up when Vanessa would introduce me to her friends as my little sister who's really into computers, in a tone that made it sound like an unfortunate hobby rather than a profession. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the months of isolation, of rebuilding myself in silence. Maybe it was the long nights coding in that garden shed, proving to myself that I still had value even if no one else could see it. Maybe it was just exhaustion with the role I'd been playing for too long. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Whatever it was, I felt something shift inside me, a quiet refusal to accept Vanessa's narrative as the final word on who I was. I met Patricia's gaze and saw something unexpected there. Not pity, not dismissal, but a sharp, assessing interest. She tilted her head slightly and asked, "What kind of tech work were you doing in Denver, Claire?" Vanessa jumped in before I could answer, still smiling, still performing. "Oh, data stuff, analytics, very technical." Claire's brilliant with numbers, always has been, but you know how those corporate environments can be. Not everyone thrives in that kind of cutthroat atmosphere. Another pat on my arm, another implicit suggestion that I'd been too soft, too sensitive, too unable to compete. The important thing is she's taking care of herself now, spending time with family. Success isn't everything, right? The irony of Vanessa saying that, at her elaborately expensive wedding designed to showcase her success, was so thick I almost choked on it. Patricia's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. She kept her attention on me, pointedly ignoring Vanessa's attempts to control the narrative. Analytics is a broad field. What specifically were you working on? There was genuine curiosity in her voice, the tone of someone asking a real question rather than making polite conversation. I could have deflected. Could have given some vague answer that confirmed Vanessa's story and let the moment pass. Could have stayed small and invisible the way I'd been trained to be. Instead, I heard myself say, I was developing machine learning algorithms for predictive modeling in enterprise resource planning systems. My last project involved creating a neural network that could optimize supply chain logistics in real time, reducing overhead costs by an average of 18% across multiple variables. The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds but felt much longer. Vanessa's smile had frozen in place, her hand tightening slightly on my arm. She hadn't expected me to engage, certainly hadn't expected me to sound competent. Patricia's eyebrows rose fractionally, the first crack in her professional composure. "That's sophisticated work," she said slowly. "We've been exploring similar applications in healthcare data management. The challenge is always integrating predictive models with existing legacy systems without disrupting current operations." I nodded, feeling my confidence return like blood flow to a sleeping limb. Exactly. Most enterprise solutions try to replace entire systems, which creates massive transition costs and resistance from end users. What I found more effective was building a middleware layer that could interpret data across multiple platforms and generate actionable insights without requiring a complete infrastructure overhaul. Vanessa laughed, high and artificial. "See, this is what I mean. Claire gets so deep into the technical stuff, she forgets that most of us have no idea what she's talking about." She turned to Patricia with an apologetic smile. "You'll have to forgive her, she can get a bit lost in her own world. It's sweet, really, how passionate she is about it." The dismissal was clear, my knowledge was irrelevant, my expertise a social liability, my passion something to be indulged rather than respected. But Patricia wasn't looking at Vanessa anymore. She was studying me with the focus of someone who just noticed something valuable that everyone else had overlooked. "Actually," Patricia said, her voice taking on a cooler edge. That's exactly the kind of technical depth I need from the people I work with. In fact, it's the kind of insight I've been looking for from your agency, Vanessa, and haven't quite received. Vanessa's smile faltered for just an instant before she recovered. Well, our team at the agency has been working hard to meet your needs, Patricia. I know we've had some back and forth on the latest campaign, but I think we're really close to nailing the messaging. She was trying to steer the conversation back to safe territory, back to her domain of expertise. But Patricia had already shifted her attention, already started asking different questions. Claire, she said, completely bypassing Vanessa now, you said you were working on this in Denver. Past tense. What are you working on now? This was the moment. I could lie, could maintain the fiction that I was adrift and aimless, could protect Vanessa's narrative and my own pride by keeping my current project secret. Or I could tell the truth and risk whatever came next. I took a breath and dove in. I'm developing an independent analytics platform designed for mid-market companies that need enterprise-level insights without enterprise-level budgets. It's still in beta, but the early results have been promising. The system uses adaptive algorithms that learn from each client's specific data patterns and industry variables, which means it becomes more accurate and valuable over time rather than requiring constant manual updates. Patricia set down her gin and tonic with deliberate care. When she spoke, her voice had shifted from polite interest to professional intensity. And you're doing this independently? You have beta clients already? I nodded. 3 companies are running pilot programs now. A regional healthcare network, a manufacturing firm, and a logistics company. The feedback has been positive enough that I'm preparing to launch a commercial version in the next quarter. Vanessa made a small sound, something between a laugh and a cough. Claire, come on. You've been living in Dad's house for months. If you had some big project going on, don't you think someone would have noticed? The condescension in her voice was automatic, reflexive. She genuinely couldn't conceive that I might have been building something significant while she dismissed me as an unemployed loser who needed wedding planning tasks to feel useful. And in that moment, watching her perform for Patricia while belittling me, I realized something crucial. Vanessa didn't actually know anything about what I'd been doing. She'd never asked. Never shown the slightest curiosity about my days, my work, my plans. She'd constructed her narrative based on assumptions and never bothered to verify whether it matched reality. Patricia pulled out her phone. What's the name of your platform? Claire Analytics, I said, keeping my voice steady. The website is still minimal, mostly a landing page with a demo video and a contact form, but it's functional. I watched Patricia's fingers move across her screen, watched her face as she found the site, watched her expression shift from skeptical to thoughtful to genuinely impressed. She spent a full minute scrolling, reading, evaluating. Vanessa stood beside me, her arms still linked through mine but her body language growing increasingly tense as she sensed something slipping out of her control. Finally, Patricia looked up. Claire, I'd like to schedule a proper meeting with you. Our data infrastructure is becoming unwieldy as we scale, and what you're describing sounds like it might address several pain points we've been struggling with. Are you taking on new clients? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. Vanessa's grip on my arm had become almost painful. I gently extracted myself and met Patricia's gaze directly. I am. I can send you a detailed prospectus and arrange a demo whenever works with your schedule. Patricia nodded and handed me her business card. Email me directly. I'm very interested in exploring this further. That's when Vanessa's composure finally cracked. Her voice rose just enough to draw attention from nearby guests. Patricia, I really don't think this is appropriate. Claire is going through a difficult time, and I don't want her to be put in a position where she's making promises she might not be able to keep. You know how it is with people who've had setbacks, they can sometimes overstate their capabilities. She turned to me with a look that was meant to be compassionate but came across as patronizing. Claire, honey, you don't need to impress anyone here. We all understand you're still finding your footing. The words landed like stones. This was the moment I'd been waiting for without knowing it, the culmination of years of being minimized and explained away and treated as the less-than sister who needed to be managed and protected from her own inadequacies. Patricia's expression had gone cold in a way that made the October air feel warm by comparison. She looked at Vanessa with the kind of disappointment usually reserved for employees who'd fundamentally misunderstood their role. "Vanessa," she said, her voice quiet but carrying unmistakable weight, "I've been in this industry for 30 years. I know how to evaluate talent and assess capabilities. What I just heard from your sister demonstrated more technical knowledge and strategic thinking than I've received from 6 months of presentations from your agency." Vanessa's face went pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. Patricia, I didn't mean to imply that you couldn't judge for yourself. I was just trying to protect Claire from feeling pressured." But Patricia was done being polite. "What you were doing was diminishing your sister's accomplishments in front of someone you're trying to impress. And frankly, if this is how you represent the people around you, I have serious concerns about how you're representing my company." She turned back to me, her expression softening slightly. "Claire, please do send me that information. I look forward to speaking with you properly." She walked away, leaving Vanessa and me standing alone on the terrace while the party continued around us, oblivious to the small detonation that had just occurred. Vanessa turned to me, her eyes bright with something between fury and panic. "What the hell did you just do?" Her voice was low and harsh, all pretense of sisterly affection abandoned. "That was my biggest client, Claire. My career depends on that account. And you just, you've been lying to everyone about being unemployed? Playing the victim while secretly working on some project?" I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and felt a strange calm settle over me. "I never lied, Vanessa. I never said I wasn't working. You assumed, and I let you, because honestly it was easier than trying to explain anything to someone who'd already decided I was a failure." My voice was steady, empty of anger or vindication, just stating facts. "You needed me to be the unsuccessful sister, the cautionary tale, the one who proved that you made all the right choices. So that's what I let you see." Vanessa's hands were shaking. "You deliberately sabotaged me. At my own wedding." I shook my head slowly. "No." I answered Patricia's questions honestly. "You sabotage yourself by trying to use me as a prop to make yourself look better." I took a step back, creating physical distance between us. "I'm going to go now. Congratulations on your marriage, Vanessa. I genuinely hope you and Howard will be happy together." I turned and walked back through the terrace doors into the ballroom, feeling lighter with every step, as if I'd been carrying something heavy for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to move freely. I found my father near the dessert table, looking uncomfortable in his rental tux. When I told him I was leaving early, he nodded in understanding. "What happened?" he asked quietly. I smiled, surprising myself with how genuine it felt. "I think I just stopped pretending to be smaller than I am." He squeezed my shoulder, pride evident in his eyes. "About damn time, kiddo." I drove home in the golden light of late afternoon, windows down, feeling the warm air rush through the car. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia Caldwell. Just 3 words, Monday. 10 a.m. And underneath, an address in downtown Portland. I pulled into the driveway of my father's house, past the garden where the shed stood with its glowing windows and humming computer equipment. Tomorrow I would send Patricia the detailed prospectus I'd been preparing. Tomorrow I would start planning the presentation that might determine whether my platform lived or died. But tonight, I sat on the back porch with a beer from my father's fridge and watched the sun set over Ashwood Hills, feeling for the first time in months like the story being written was mine to control. Inside the house, my phone continued buzzing with increasingly frantic messages from Vanessa. I didn't read them. There would be time for that conversation later, when she was ready to hear things she didn't want to know. For now, I let myself enjoy the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the best revenge isn't planning elaborate schemes or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it's just refusing to be what other people need you to be. Sometimes it's standing up at exactly the right moment and showing them who you actually are. The string quartet's music faded in my memory, replaced by the sound of crickets and distant traffic. Somewhere across town, Vanessa was probably trying to salvage her evening, explaining away what had happened, spinning a new narrative that didn't make her look quite so foolish. Let her. I was done living in her version of my story. This was mine now. And I was just getting started. The Monday morning air carried the crispness of approaching winter as I stepped off the elevator on the 23rd floor of the glass tower that housed Caldwell and Associates. My laptop bag felt heavier than usual, weighted with the prototype software, backup files, and printed materials I'd spent the entire weekend perfecting. I'd barely slept, running simulations and stress tests, checking every line of code for vulnerabilities, rehearsing answers to questions Patricia might ask. The reception area was all clean lines and minimalist design, the kind of studied simplicity that cost a fortune to achieve. A young man behind the curved desk looked up with a professionally neutral expression that shifted to something warmer when I gave my name. "Patricia Caldwell is expecting you," he said, gesturing toward a hallway lined with frosted glass conference rooms. "Third door on the right." "She's already in there." I found Patricia seated at a long table, her laptop open, reading glasses perched on her nose as she scrolled through what looked like financial reports. She glanced up when I entered and removed her glasses with a slight smile. "Claire. Right on time. Coffee?" I accepted gratefully, needing the caffeine more than I wanted to admit. She poured from a carafe that sat on a warming tray, the simple gesture somehow putting me at ease despite my nerves. We spent the first 15 minutes on pleasantries and context setting. She asked about my background, my education, the trajectory that had led me from a comfortable corporate position to building something independently. I gave her the honest version, including the parts about my former supervisor's theft and the subsequent reputation damage. I'd learned that trying to hide professional setbacks only made them loom larger. Patricia listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me with those sharp gray eyes. "Your sister called me yesterday evening. 3 times, actually. Left increasingly agitated voicemails about how I'd misunderstood the situation at the wedding, how you'd been struggling with reliability issues, how she was concerned I might be making a decision based on incomplete information." The words hit like cold water, but I kept my expression neutral. Patricia continued, her tone dry. "She also sent an email this morning suggesting that any business discussions with you should probably include your family's input since you've been under considerable stress lately." It took me a moment to process what Vanessa had done. She'd spent the hours after her wedding not celebrating with her new husband but trying to poison my professional opportunity before it could develop. The betrayal shouldn't have surprised me, but the speed and calculated nature of it did. I set down my coffee cup carefully, buying time to steady my voice. "I'm not under anyone's guardianship, if that's what she was implying. I'm 32 years old and perfectly capable of managing my own business affairs." Patricia waved a hand dismissively. "Obviously. I wouldn't have invited you here if I thought otherwise. But I'm telling you this because you should know what you're dealing with. Your sister is scared. She spent 6 months selling me marketing services that promise data-driven insights and strategic analytics, and I just discovered at her wedding that the person who could actually deliver those things has been living 20 minutes away and she's been calling you an unemployed loser." The bluntness made me flinch, but there was something almost kind in Patricia's directness. She wasn't sugarcoating reality, just stating it plainly. "I appreciate you telling me. It doesn't surprise me, but it's good to know." Patricia nodded and opened a different file on her laptop. "Now let me tell you what I actually need, and you can tell me whether your platform can deliver it. Caldwell and Associates has grown from 40 employees to 230 in the past 3 years. Our client base has expanded from regional healthcare systems to national accounts. The problem is that our data infrastructure was built for a much smaller operation. We're running 3 different legacy systems that don't communicate effectively with each other. Our analytics are always at least 2 weeks behind real time, which means we're making strategic decisions based on information that's already outdated by the time we see it." She pulled up a diagram that showed the tangled web of their current setup, color-coded boxes connected by a maze of lines that looked more like modern art than functional architecture. "We've had 2 different consulting firms come in and propose solutions. Both wanted to tear everything down and rebuild from scratch, which would cost somewhere north of $2 million and require shutting down major operations for months during the transition. I can't do that. We have contractual obligations, regulatory compliance requirements, and a board of directors who will absolutely lose their minds if I tell them we need to go dark for a quarter while we rewire the entire company. So what I need is someone who can work with what we have, find a way to integrate these systems without replacing them, and give us real-time analytics that actually help us make better decisions. Can you do that? I stood up and moved to the whiteboard that covered one wall of the conference room. May I? Patricia gestured for me to proceed. I uncapped a marker and started sketching, thinking out loud as I drew. The problem with most enterprise solutions is they're designed to be comprehensive, which means they're also inflexible. They want to own your entire data ecosystem, which creates exactly the kind of massive transition costs you're describing. What I've built is different. It's designed to sit on top of existing systems as an interpretation layer. Think of it as a translator that can read data from multiple sources, normalize it into a common framework, and then run analytics across the complete dataset without requiring any of the underlying systems to change. I drew boxes representing her legacy systems and then a cloud layer above them representing my platform. The system uses API connections to pull data at whatever interval you specify. Could be real-time streaming if your systems support it, could be hourly batch updates if that's more practical. The machine learning component identifies patterns across your different data sources and builds predictive models based on your specific business variables. The more it runs, the more accurate it becomes because it's learning from your actual operational outcomes rather than generic industry benchmarks. Patricia had moved to stand beside me, studying the diagram with intense focus. What about security? We handle protected health information, which means HIPAA compliance isn't optional. I nodded. The platform is built with encrypted data transmission and storage as baseline architecture, not an add-on feature. Each client's data is isolated in its own secure environment with role-based access controls. I can provide you with the full security documentation, but the short version is that it meets or exceeds all standard healthcare data protection requirements. She asked 3 more technical questions in rapid succession, each one probing a different potential weakness in the system. I answered them all, grateful for the months of development work that had forced me to think through exactly these scenarios. Finally, Patricia returned to her seat and opened a different file. I'm going to be direct with you, Claire. I've been unhappy with Vanessa's agency for the past 2 months. The work isn't bad, but it's not what I was sold. I was promised strategic thinking grounded in data analysis. What I've gotten is creative campaigns that look nice but don't actually move the metrics I care about. I've been considering terminating the contract, but I haven't had a clear alternative to move toward. Now I do. The implications of what she was saying settled over me slowly. You're going to fire my sister's agency. Patricia met my gaze steadily. I'm going to end a business relationship that isn't delivering value. The fact that your sister runs the agency is unfortunate, but it's not the determining factor. What happened at the wedding just clarified something I'd already been suspecting, which is that the gap between what they promised and what they're delivering isn't going to close. She paused, then added, I'm telling you this because I want to be transparent about the situation you're walking into. If you agree to work with Caldwell and Associates, it's going to create family complications for you. Your sister is going to blame you for losing her biggest account. So you need to decide whether you're willing to deal with that fallout. I thought about Vanessa's voicemails to Patricia, her attempts to undermine me before I'd even had a chance to present my work. I thought about years of casual diminishment, of being introduced as the less successful sister, of having my accomplishments explained away or ignored. I thought about standing in that garden shed night after night, building something I believed in while everyone assumed I was falling apart. When I spoke, my voice was calm and certain. Vanessa made her choices. She chose to dismiss me publicly, she chose to misrepresent my situation, and she chose to try sabotaging this meeting rather than improving her own work. Those were her decisions, not mine. I'm not responsible for managing her career or protecting her from the consequences of her own actions. If you want to end your contract with her agency, that's a business decision based on the value you're receiving. I can't control how she reacts to it, and honestly, I'm done trying to make myself smaller so she can feel bigger. Patricia smiled, a real smile this time rather than the professional mask. Good. I was hoping you'd say something like that, because I need people who can make difficult decisions without getting paralyzed by politics or relationships. She pulled out a contract that had clearly been prepared in advance. This is a 6-month pilot agreement. You'll integrate your platform with our 3 main data systems, provide real-time analytics dashboards for our senior leadership team, and deliver monthly reports on key performance metrics. The compensation is outlined in Section 4. If the pilot is successful, we'll negotiate a longer-term contract with expanded scope. I flipped to Section 4 and felt my breath catch. The number was more than I'd earned in my last year at the Denver firm. This is generous, I managed to say. Patricia shrugged. It's market rate for the value you're providing. Don't undercharge because you're worried about seeming greedy. That's how women end up earning less than men for equivalent work. We spent the next hour going through the contract details, discussing timelines and deliverables and technical specifications. Patricia introduced me to her CTO, a sharp woman named Diane who asked even harder questions than Patricia had and seemed genuinely excited about the platform's capabilities. By the time I left the building at noon, I had a signed contract in my bag and a project timeline that would consume the next 6 months of my life. I sat in my car in the parking garage for several minutes, just breathing, letting the reality sink in. I'd done it. I'd built something valuable and found someone willing to pay for it. I'd taken the wreckage of my Denver career and transformed it into a foundation for something better. My phone buzzed. A text from my father. How did it go? I typed back quickly. I'll tell you everything over dinner. But Dad? I think it went really well. His response came immediately. Proud of you, kiddo. Always have been. I started the car and headed toward home, my mind already racing through the technical challenges ahead. I'd need to set up secure data connections with Caldwell systems, customize the analytics dashboards for their specific needs, and probably hire at least one assistant to help with the workload. The garden shed wasn't going to cut it anymore. I'd need real office space, proper equipment, maybe even incorporate as an actual business rather than operating as a freelancer. The practical considerations flooded in, both exciting and overwhelming. I was halfway to Ashwood Hills when my phone rang through the car's Bluetooth. Vanessa's name appeared on the dashboard screen. I considered ignoring it, but curiosity won out. I accepted the call. The explosion of sound that erupted from the speakers made me instinctively lower the volume. You absolute bitch. Vanessa's voice was raw with fury, stripped of all the polished charm she usually performed. Patricia Caldwell just terminated our contract. Sent a formal notice this morning, effective in 30 days. Do you have any idea what you've done? You destroyed my career because you couldn't stand that I was successful and you weren't. I kept my voice level, refusing to match her energy. I didn't destroy anything, Vanessa. I went to a meeting and presented my work. Patricia made her own decision about her business relationship with your agency. Those are 2 separate things. Like hell they are. She yelled. You showed up at my wedding and deliberately undermined me in front of my most important client. You sabotaged me on purpose because you're jealous. The accusation was so absurd it almost made me laugh. Vanessa, you introduced me as an unemployed loser to impress Patricia. You tried to use my supposed failure as proof of your own success. That's not my fault, that's yours. And when it turned out I wasn't actually failing, when it turned out I'd been building something valuable while you were dismissing me, you couldn't handle it. So instead of being happy for me or even just leaving it alone, you called Patricia 3 times and sent her emails trying to convince her I was unreliable and needed family supervision. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. When Vanessa spoke again, her voice had shifted from rage to something more calculated. I was trying to protect you. You've been through a lot, Claire. The situation in Denver clearly affected you more than you want to admit. I was worried that you were making promises you couldn't keep and that it would blow up in your face. I didn't want to see you get hurt. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that I could almost see how it had worked on me for years. The reframing of cruelty as concern, the suggestion that my perception of events was distorted, the implication that she knew my reality better than I did. But I'd spent too many hours in that garden shed, proving to myself that I was capable, to fall for it now. Vanessa, I said quietly, you don't get to rewrite what happened. You called me an unemployed loser to my face, in front of someone you wanted to impress, because it made you feel superior. When that backfired, you tried to sabotage my professional opportunity rather than accepting that maybe you'd misjudged the situation. Those are facts, not interpretations. And the reason Patricia terminated your contract isn't because I manipulated her or said terrible things about you. It's because she'd already been unhappy with your work for months, and seeing how you treated me confirmed some concerns she had about your judgment and professionalism. I heard Vanessa's breathing quicken, could practically feel her scrambling for a new angle of attack. Dad put you up to this, didn't he? He always liked you better, always took your side. He probably helped you plan this whole thing, building your little project in his shed while filling your head with ideas about how talented you are. This is his revenge for me being successful when you weren't. The desperation in her voice was almost painful to hear. She was cycling through every excuse, every external factor she could blame, because accepting responsibility would mean admitting she'd created her own problems. Vanessa, I'm going to go now. I hope you're able to find new clients for your agency. I genuinely do. You're good at what you do when you're not trying to elevate yourself by diminishing other people. But I can't help you with this, and I'm not going to apologize for succeeding. I ended the call before she could respond. The rest of the drive home passed in silence except for the hum of tires on asphalt. I felt tired more than triumphant, drained by the emotional confrontation even though I'd held my ground. Part of me wanted Vanessa to understand, to acknowledge what she'd done, to maybe even apologize. But I was starting to accept that might never happen. Some people were so invested in their narrative that they'd burn everything down rather than admit they might have been wrong. When I pulled into the driveway, my father was sitting on the porch steps, a beer in hand and another waiting beside him. He held up the second bottle as I approached. Figured you might need this. I sat down beside him and accepted the beer, the cold glass soothing against my palm. Vanessa called me, he said after a moment. About 20 minutes ago. She was pretty upset. I took a long drink before answering. She blames me for Patricia ending their contract. Thinks I deliberately sabotaged her. My father nodded slowly. She said something similar to me. Also said I'd enabled your delusions of competence and that we'd both regret it when your project inevitably failed. His tone was mild, but I could hear the hurt underneath. Vanessa had always been careful with our father, maintaining the dutiful daughter performance even while tearing me down. This was new territory. I'm sorry she dragged you into this. He shook his head. Don't be. I'm not. He turned to look at me directly. Claire, I've watched you disappear yourself for years trying to keep peace with your sister. Making yourself quiet so she could be loud, making yourself small so she could feel big. I understood why you did it, especially after your mother passed. You didn't want more conflict, didn't want to be the problem child. But I've been waiting for you to remember that you don't owe anyone your silence. That you're allowed to be talented and successful and visible without apologizing for it. His words cracked something open in my chest. I'd spent so long believing that being the peacekeeper was noble, that absorbing hurt without reacting made me the bigger person. But maybe it had just made me invisible. We sat together as the afternoon light faded, not talking much, just being present. Eventually my father stood and stretched. I'm making spaghetti for dinner. The good kind with the Italian sausage. You staying? I smiled. Yeah, Dad. I'm staying. Over dinner, I told him everything. The details of the contract with Caldwell and Associates, the scope of work ahead, the challenges I'd need to overcome. He listened with the focused attention he'd always given to things that mattered, asking questions that showed he understood more about business strategy than I'd given him credit for. When I mentioned needing office space, he suggested the converted warehouse district downtown where several tech startups had set up shop. Affordable rent, good infrastructure, the kind of collaborative environment that might lead to future opportunities. After we'd cleaned up the dishes, I retreated to the garden shed and opened my laptop. There were emails waiting, including one from Diane at Caldwell and Associates with technical specifications for their data systems and access credentials for their test environment. I spent the next 4 hours mapping out the integration architecture, identifying potential bottlenecks, and drafting a project plan that broke the work into manageable phases. The familiar rhythm of problem solving, of translating business needs into technical solutions, felt like coming home. Around midnight, I took a break and checked my phone. There were 7 missed calls from Vanessa and a string of text messages that devolved from angry to pleading to threatening. The final one read, "You've always been jealous of me. This is your revenge for me being everything you're not. Hope it's worth destroying our family." I stared at the message for a long time, feeling the old instinct to defend myself, to explain, to try making her understand. But I was done performing emotional labor for someone who refused to see me clearly. Instead, I opened a new message and typed carefully, "Vanessa, I'm not going to engage with attacks or accusations. What happened at your wedding and afterward were consequences of choices you made, not actions I took against you. If you want to have a real conversation someday about our relationship and how we got here, I'm open to that. But I'm not going to defend myself against a version of events that isn't true. I wish you well, and I hope you find success with your agency. But I'm moving forward with my own work now, and I need you to respect that." I hit send before I could second-guess myself, then turned off my phone completely. The silence that followed felt like breathing room, space to exist without constantly monitoring for the next attack or manipulation. The next morning, I drove downtown to look at office spaces. The warehouse district my father had mentioned was exactly what I needed: high ceilings, exposed brick, the kind of creative energy that came from artists and programmers and small business owners all occupying the same converted industrial space. I found a unit on the 3rd floor, just under 1,000 square feet, with big windows overlooking the street and enough room for a proper workspace, a small meeting area, and maybe eventually space for that assistant I'd need to hire. The rent was manageable, especially with the Caldwell contract funding things. I signed a lease on the spot, effective immediately. Over the following week, I threw myself into work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I set up the office with second-hand furniture and professional equipment, spent 12-hour days coding the integration protocols for Caldwell systems, and started reaching out to the other companies who'd expressed interest in pilot programs. The momentum was intoxicating. Every problem I solved, every successful test run, every positive email from Diane confirming that yes, this was working exactly as promised, felt like proof that I'd been right to bet on myself. My father helped me move my equipment from the shed to the new office, making multiple trips in his old pickup truck. On the final load, he stood in the middle of the space and nodded approvingly. "Your mother would have been proud of this," he said quietly. "I know she didn't always show it, and I know she compared you to Vanessa more than she should have. But she would have been proud." The validation I hadn't known I needed landed softly, a gift offered without expectation of response. 2 weeks after signing the Caldwell contract, I received an email from Patricia. She wanted to schedule lunch, her treat, to discuss something outside the scope of our current project. We met at a downtown restaurant with white tablecloths and a wine list that made my eyes water. Patricia ordered for both of us with the confidence of someone who ate at places like this regularly, then got straight to the point. I've been talking with some colleagues who run companies in similar growth phases as Caldwell and Associates. Several of them are dealing with the same data infrastructure problems we were facing. I took the liberty of showing them your platform's capabilities, obviously without revealing any proprietary details from our implementation. 3 of them want to talk to you about pilot programs. She slid a sheet of paper across the table with company names, contact information, and brief descriptions of their technical needs. "These are serious opportunities, Claire. If you can deliver for them the way you're delivering for us, you're looking at the foundation for a real company, not just a freelance operation." I stared at the paper, my mind racing through the implications. This was how businesses scaled, through referrals and reputation, through delivering value that made clients want to introduce you to their networks. Patricia continued, "And there's something else you should know. I'm on the board of the Portland Tech Alliance, which is a coalition of mid-sized companies working on shared challenges around talent, infrastructure, and policy. We're always looking for innovative solutions to common problems. If your platform proves out the way I think it will, I'd like to present it at our quarterly meeting in December. That's about 80 CEOs and CTOs in one room, all of them managing similar scaling challenges. The opportunity was staggering, almost overwhelming. "This is incredibly generous of you," I managed to say. Patricia shook her head. "It's not generosity, it's smart business. I'm investing in someone who delivers results, and I'm positioning myself as the person who discovered you before everyone else figured out how valuable your work is. That's good for my reputation and good for Caldwell's relationships in the industry. So don't think of it as charity. Think of it as networking with purpose." We spent the rest of lunch discussing strategy, talking through how to scale operations, what kind of team I'd need to build, how to structure pricing for different company sizes. Patricia had clearly been thinking about this longer than I had, seeing possibilities I hadn't yet imagined. By the time we finished, my head was spinning with plans and potential futures. Walking back to my office, I passed a coffee shop where Vanessa and I used to meet when I'd first moved back to Ashwood Hills. Through the window, I saw a woman who looked like her for just a moment, and felt a pang of something complicated. Not quite grief, not quite guilt, but a recognition of loss nonetheless. We'd never been close in the way sisters in movies were close, but there had been moments of genuine connection buried under years of competition and comparison. Maybe those moments could have grown into something better if we'd both been different people, if our mother hadn't pitted us against each other, if Vanessa hadn't needed to win quite so desperately. But we were who we were, and some relationships couldn't be salvaged no matter how much you wanted to believe otherwise. That evening, I called the 3 companies Patricia had referred. Each conversation confirmed that she'd set me up well, preparing them to be receptive and positioning my platform as a solution to problems they'd been struggling to solve. I scheduled demos for the following week, already mentally mapping out how to customize presentations for each company's specific needs. My phone rang late that night. An unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Claire." The voice was hesitant, almost unrecognizable. It took me a moment to place it. "Howard. Vanessa's husband. I'm sorry to call so late. I hope this is okay." The uncertainty in his voice put me on alert. "Is everything all right? Is Vanessa okay?" There was a pause, the sound of him moving to a different room, a door closing. "She's fine. Physically, anyway. But I needed to talk to you, and I didn't want her to know I was calling." I waited, letting him find the words. "Claire, I need you to understand that I didn't know about what she said at the wedding, about how she's been treating you. I mean, I knew you two weren't close, but I didn't realize the extent of it until afterward. When she started calling Patricia and trying to sabotage your meeting, when she spent our wedding night obsessing over how to fix what had happened, I started putting pieces together that I'd been too oblivious to see before." His voice carried genuine distress, and I found myself feeling sorry for him despite everything. "Howard, you don't need to apologize for Vanessa's choices," he continued as if I hadn't spoken. "I found her journal last week. She doesn't know I read it, and I feel terrible about invading her privacy, but I'd been so confused about why she was spiraling so badly, and I thought maybe understanding would help. Claire, the things she wrote about you. The way she's been actively working to undermine you for years. Complaining to mutual friends about you being difficult, spreading rumors about why you really left Denver, taking credit for things you'd done. There was a log of it, like she was keeping score." I felt cold despite the warm office. I'd suspected some of this, but having it confirmed was different. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because someone needs to," Howard said quietly, "and because I'm realizing I married someone I don't know as well as I thought I did. I love Vanessa, but I don't like what she's become. And I think part of that is because no one has ever held her accountable for how she treats people. Everyone just accepts it because she's successful and charming, and they don't want to rock the boat. Including me." We talked for another 20 minutes. Howard told me about growing tensions in their marriage, about how Vanessa's obsession with status and appearance had intensified since losing the Caldwell account, about his own growing discomfort with being married to someone whose success seemed to require other people's failure. I listened more than I spoke, recognizing that he needed to process this out loud more than he needed my input. When we finally hung up, I sat in the quiet office feeling the full weight of everything that had shifted in the past few weeks. I hadn't set out to destroy Vanessa's career or marriage. I just stopped accepting her narrative about who I was supposed to be. But the ripples from that decision were spreading wider than I'd anticipated, touching lives and relationships in ways I couldn't fully control or predict. The question was whether I felt guilty about it. I examined the emotion carefully, turning it over like an object I was trying to identify. There was sadness, certainly. Regret that things couldn't have unfolded differently, that our relationship had been so damaged that repair might be impossible. But guilt? No. I didn't feel guilty for refusing to be small, for building something valuable, for telling the truth when asked direct questions. Those weren't crimes. They were just choices that challenged a system that had worked well for Vanessa and poorly for me. I turned back to my laptop and opened the presentation I was building for next week's client demos. The work was good. The platform was solid. The opportunities ahead were real and earned. Whatever complicated feelings existed around family and fairness and the cost of success, they couldn't change the fundamental fact that I'd built something worthwhile and people were willing to pay for it. That was enough. It had to be enough. Because going back to being invisible wasn't an option anymore, no matter how much easier it might make things for everyone else. The November rain hammered against the office windows in sheets, turning the street below into a river of reflected neon and headlights. I'd been in the new space for 3 weeks now, and the rhythm of independent work had begun to feel natural rather than terrifying. The Caldwell integration was ahead of schedule. The 3 referral companies had all signed pilot agreements after seeing the demos, and I'd just hired my first employee. Her name was Rita Parsons, a recent graduate from Portland State with a computer science degree and an enthusiasm for data architecture that reminded me of myself 10 years ago. She sat at the desk I'd set up near the windows, headphones on, completely absorbed in debugging a query optimization routine I'd assigned her that morning. My phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender was someone named Marcus Webb, the subject line reading, "Speaking Opportunity, Portland Tech Alliance December Meeting." I opened it with interest, knowing this was likely connected to Patricia's mention of presenting to the coalition. The email was formal and detailed, explaining that Patricia Caldwell had recommended me as a potential speaker for their quarterly forum. The topic would be innovative approaches to data integration for scaling companies, with a focus on practical solutions rather than theoretical frameworks. The audience would include decision makers from 80 member companies, representing a combined revenue of over $3 billion. They were offering a 30-minute speaking slot, followed by a 15-minute question and answer session. The honorarium was modest but respectable, and more importantly, the exposure could transform my business from a promising startup into an established player in the regional tech ecosystem. I read through the email 3 times, my initial excitement gradually mixing with a familiar anxiety. Public speaking had never been my strength. I could present technical information to small groups without much trouble, but the idea of standing in front of 80 executives and making a compelling case for my platform triggered every imposter syndrome trigger I possessed. What if I stumbled over my words? What if the questions exposed gaps in my thinking? What if I came across as inexperienced or naive compared to the seasoned professionals in that room? I forced myself to respond before the doubts could paralyze me. I confirmed my availability and interest, asked for more details about the venue and technical setup, and requested examples of successful presentations from previous meetings. After hitting send, I stood and stretched, working out the tension that had settled into my shoulders. Rita pulled off her headphones and swiveled to face me. "Everything okay? You look stressed." I told her about the speaking opportunity and the mixture of excitement and terror it inspired. She grinned, the kind of fearless expression that only people in their early 20s could manage. "That's amazing though. Do you know how many businesses would kill for that kind of platform? You're going to crush it." Her confidence was infectious, even if I didn't entirely share it. I spent the rest of the afternoon outlining what I wanted to say, sketching the narrative arc that would take the audience from problem identification through solution architecture to real-world results. The key would be making it concrete rather than abstract, showing them actual data from the Caldwell implementation rather than just describing theoretical benefits. That evening, I stayed late at the office, refining the presentation structure and building demo slides that would illustrate the platform's capabilities without overwhelming people with technical details. Around 8, my phone rang. My father's name appeared on the screen. "Claire," he said when I answered, his voice carrying an unusual heaviness. "I need to tell you something, and I don't want you hearing it from someone else first." My stomach tightened. "What happened?" "Vanessa came by the house this afternoon. She wanted to talk, said she'd been trying to reach you but you weren't responding to her messages. I let her in because, well, she's still my daughter, and I thought maybe she was ready to have an actual conversation rather than just hurling accusations." He paused, and I heard him take a breath. "It didn't go well. She spent 20 minutes telling me that you'd stolen her client, destroyed her reputation, and turned her husband against her. Said you'd been planning this for months, playing the victim while secretly preparing to stab her in the back. When I tried to suggest that maybe things were more complicated than that, she told me I'd always been a terrible father who played favorites and that she was done trying to win approval from people who didn't appreciate her." The words landed like stones, each one creating ripples I could feel from miles away. "I'm sorry, Dad. You shouldn't have to deal with her anger at me." He made a dismissive sound. "I'm a grown man, Claire. I can handle your sister's temper tantrum. What concerns me is where her head is at. She's not thinking clearly, not seeing things as they are. She's constructed this whole narrative where you're the villain and she's the victim, and she's committed to it in a way that worries me. People who can't acknowledge their own role and their problems tend to keep making the same mistakes until something breaks." We talked for another few minutes, mostly him reassuring me that he was fine and me feeling guilty anyway. After hanging up, I sat in the quiet office and let myself feel the full weight of family fracture. There was no path forward that didn't involve loss. Either I continued succeeding and accepted that it would drive the wedge deeper between Vanessa and me, or I sabotaged myself to preserve a relationship that had never been healthy to begin with. When framed that clearly, the choice was obvious. But knowing what you had to do didn't make it hurt less. The following week brought a rhythm of intense productivity. Rita was proving to be exactly the kind of detail-oriented, proactive teammate I needed, catching errors before they became problems and suggesting improvements I hadn't considered. The Caldwell integration moved into its final testing phase, with Diane sending increasingly enthusiastic emails about the performance metrics they were seeing. One morning, Patricia forwarded me a message from Caldwell's CFO expressing amazement at having real-time visibility into operational costs for the first time in the company's history. Apparently they'd identified 3 areas of inefficiency that, once corrected, would save them close to $400,000 annually. The fact that my platform had paid for itself many times over in just the first month of operation was the kind of validation that made all the late nights and stress worthwhile. I was deep into preparing the Tech Alliance presentation when my phone rang with an unfamiliar local number. I almost sent it to voicemail but decided to answer. "Claire Bennett?" The voice was male, professional, unfamiliar. "This is Derek Patterson. I'm an attorney with Morrison and Associates here in Portland. I represent your sister, Vanessa Bennett Reeves." My entire body went cold. "What can I do for you, Mr. Patterson?" His tone remained neutral, carefully devoid of emotion. "I'm calling to inform you that my client intends to pursue legal action regarding what she characterizes as tortious interference with business relationships and misappropriation of proprietary information. She alleges that you used confidential information obtained through your access to family discussions to deliberately sabotage her professional relationship with Caldwell and Associates, and that you falsely represented your qualifications and capabilities to induce Ms. Caldwell to terminate her contract with my client's agency." The accusations were so absurd I almost laughed. "Mr. Patterson, I've never had access to any of my sister's proprietary business information. I built my platform entirely independently, and my only interaction with Patricia Caldwell was answering her direct questions honestly at a social event. If your client lost her contract with Caldwell and Associates, it was due to Patricia's assessment of the work being provided, not anything I did or said." He continued as if I hadn't spoken, clearly delivering a prepared statement. My client is prepared to seek damages in the amount of $500,000, representing lost revenue from the terminated contract and damage to her professional reputation. However, she's willing to settle this matter out of court if you agree to certain terms. Those terms being? I kept my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. First, you would cease all business activities related to data analytics and software platforms for a period of no less than 2 years. Second, you would provide a written statement to Patricia Caldwell and any other parties acknowledging that your representations about your capabilities were exaggerated and that you obtained confidential information improperly. Third, you would pay my client the sum of $50,000 in compensation for damages already incurred. The sheer audacity of it left me momentarily speechless. Vanessa wanted me to shut down my business, destroy my professional reputation, and pay her for the privilege of doing so. It was transparently a punishment disguised as legal action, an attempt to force me back into invisibility because my success was too threatening to tolerate. Mr. Patterson, I said slowly, making sure every word was clear, I will not be agreeing to any of those terms. If your client wishes to pursue legal action, she's welcome to do so, and I'll respond appropriately through my own legal counsel. But I want to be very clear that I have done nothing wrong, nothing illegal, and nothing unethical. I built a legitimate business, I delivered value to clients who chose to work with me, and I will not apologize for that or cease my work because my sister finds my success inconvenient. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Ms. Bennett, I would strongly encourage you to reconsider. Litigation is expensive and time-consuming, and even if you ultimately prevail, the process itself can be damaging to emerging businesses. My client is quite serious about pursuing this matter. I'm sure she is, I replied. Please inform your client that if she proceeds with filing a lawsuit, I will vigorously defend myself and will also explore whether her actions constitute malicious prosecution or abuse of process. I ended the call and immediately looked up attorneys who specialized in business litigation. My hands were shaking, a combination of adrenaline and fury. Vanessa wasn't just angry anymore. She was actively trying to destroy what I'd built, using the legal system as a weapon because she couldn't accept that her own failures were her responsibility. I called my father and told him about the attorney's call. His response was a long silence followed by a heavy sigh. I was afraid something like this might happen. She called me yesterday asking for money to cover legal fees. Said it was a matter of principle, that she needed to defend herself against what you'd done to her. I told her I wouldn't finance a lawsuit against her own sister, and she hung up on me. We're not talking anymore. The pain in his voice was evident, and I felt a fresh wave of anger at Vanessa for putting him in this position. I spent the next 2 days consulting with attorneys, explaining the situation, and gathering documentation that would refute Vanessa's claims. Every lawyer I spoke with had the same basic assessment. Her case was weak, bordering on frivolous, and if she actually filed it, I'd likely prevail without much difficulty. But they also all warned that the process would be stressful, distracting, and expensive even if I won. Vanessa knew this. That was the point. She couldn't stop me from succeeding, but she could make success as painful and costly as possible. I was working on the Tech Alliance presentation late one evening when Rita knocked on my office door. She looked hesitant, holding her phone in a way that suggested she had something uncomfortable to share. What's going on? I asked, trying to keep my tone light. She took a breath. I don't know if you're on social media much, but there's something you should probably see. She handed me her phone, open to a Facebook post. Vanessa's profile picture smiled from the top of a long text post. The post began with vague language about betrayal and family loyalty, but quickly became more specific. She didn't name me directly, but anyone who knew us would immediately understand who she was talking about. The post described how someone close to her had stolen her client through deception and manipulation, how this person had pretended to be struggling while secretly plotting, how they'd weaponized family access to gain unfair competitive advantage. The post ended with a call for others to be cautious about people who present themselves as victims while actually being calculated opportunists. The comments section was filled with supportive responses from Vanessa's friends and professional contacts, people expressing outrage on her behalf and offering sympathy for what she was going through. A few comments specifically asked for more details or offered to help, to spread the word about this unnamed person's unethical behavior. I handed the phone back to Rita, feeling exhausted more than angry. She's trying to damage my reputation before I even have a chance to build one. Rita nodded slowly. It's pretty calculated. She's creating a narrative that positions her as the wronged party, and because she's not naming you directly, you can't really respond without looking defensive or confirming that you're the person she's talking about. Smart in a terrible way. I considered my options. I could ignore it and hope it blew over, but silence sometimes looked like admission. I could respond publicly, but that would turn family drama into a spectacle and probably make everything worse. Or I could focus on building my reputation through my work and let results speak louder than accusations. I chose the third option, but not without significant doubt. Over the next week, Vanessa's social media campaign intensified. More vague posts about betrayal, more sympathetic comments from her network, more subtle suggestions that someone in the Portland tech community was not to be trusted. She never named me, but she dropped enough details that anyone paying attention could figure it out. I started noticing a shift in how some people responded to my outreach. A few companies that had expressed initial interest in pilot programs suddenly stopped returning calls. A networking event I'd been invited to was quietly rescinded with an apologetic email about limited space. The Whisper campaign was working, at least in some circles. Patricia called me on a Thursday afternoon, her voice tight with controlled anger. "I've been hearing things," she said without preamble. "Vanessa's been making calls to people in the business community, suggesting that you somehow cheated or manipulated your way into our contract. She's being careful not to say anything actionable, but the implication is clear. I wanted you to know this is happening, and I wanted you to know that I've been pushing back hard whenever I hear it. I've told multiple people that you earned our contract through legitimate expertise, that your work has exceeded expectations, and that anyone taking Vanessa's claims seriously should consider the source and her obvious conflict of interest." The support meant more than I could articulate. "Thank you, Patricia. I know getting involved in family drama isn't something you signed up for." She made a dismissive sound. "This isn't family drama, Claire. This is a professional matter. Vanessa is making claims about your business practices, and those claims are false. I'm not defending you out of personal loyalty. I'm defending the truth because allowing lies to spread unchallenged damages the entire business community. If people can destroy competitors through whisper campaigns rather than by doing better work, we all lose." The Tech Alliance presentation was now 3 weeks away, and I threw myself into preparation with an intensity that bordered on obsession. This would be my opportunity to establish my reputation based on substance rather than rumors, to let the work speak for itself in front of an audience that valued results over gossip. I practiced the presentation dozens of times, refining every transition, anticipating every possible question, building in demonstrations that would prove capability rather than just claiming it. Rita sat through multiple practice runs, offering feedback and playing devil's advocate to help me sharpen my responses. 10 days before the presentation, I received an email from Marcus Webb. He apologized for the short notice, but they'd had a cancellation for one of the other speaking slots and wondered if I'd be interested in extending my presentation to 45 minutes instead of 30. The additional time would allow for a deeper dive into case studies and more extensive audience interaction. I accepted immediately, recognizing this as an even bigger opportunity than originally offered. A longer slot meant more visibility, more time to establish credibility, more chance to demonstrate expertise in a way that would drown out whatever rumors Vanessa had been spreading. The night before the presentation, I barely slept. I ran through the slides one more time, checked and rechecked that all the demo components were loaded and functional, laid out my clothes with more care than I'd given to anything since job interviews in my 20s. My father called around 10 to wish me luck and remind me that I knew this material better than anyone in that room would. His confidence helped, but couldn't entirely quiet the nervous energy that made my hands shake and my stomach twist. I arrived at the venue 2 hours early, a downtown hotel ballroom that had been set up with theater-style seating and a raised platform for speakers. The technical crew helped me test the presentation on their system, making sure all the animations and embedded videos played correctly. I walked through the space multiple times, getting comfortable with the layout, finding the spots where I'd stand for different sections of the talk. people began arriving around 8:30 for the 9 o'clock start time. I watched from the side of the room as the seats filled with exactly the kind of professionals Patricia had described. These were people in tailored suits and designer glasses, carrying tablets and phones that never stopped buzzing, conversations happening in the shorthand of people who worked in similar worlds. I recognized a few faces from news articles and industry events. The collective power and influence in that room was staggering, and I was about to ask them to take me seriously. Marcus Webb found me backstage about 15 minutes before my slot. He was a tall man with graying temples and an easy smile that put me somewhat at ease. "Patricia speaks very highly of you," he said warmly. "We're excited to see what you've built. The format is straightforward. I'll introduce you with a brief bio, you'll have your 45 minutes, then we'll open it up for questions. The audience here is usually pretty engaged, so don't be surprised if the Q&A runs long. That's a good sign, means you've got their attention." The presentation before mine wrapped up, some executive from a manufacturing company talking about workforce development strategies. There was polite applause, a few questions, then Marcus was at the podium introducing me. He kept it brief and professional, hitting the highlights of my background without embellishment, positioning me as someone bringing fresh perspective to persistent challenges. Then it was my turn. I walked onto the platform, my heart hammering but my step steady, and looked out at 80 faces waiting to judge whether I deserved to be there. I opened with the problem statement, describing the common scenario of growing companies trapped between inadequate existing systems and prohibitively expensive enterprise solutions. I showed data on how most small to mid-size businesses were flying blind when it came to operational analytics, making decisions based on gut feel or weeks-old information because real-time visibility seemed impossible without massive investment. I could see heads nodding, recognition of their own frustrations reflected in the examples I provided. Then I shifted to the solution architecture, walking them through how the platform worked without getting lost in technical weeds. I used visual metaphors that made complex concepts accessible. The interpretation layer as a universal translator, the machine learning component as an increasingly experienced analyst who got better with every report, the modular design as building blocks that could be configured for different needs rather than one-size-fits-all constraints. I showed actual screenshots from the Caldwell implementation, real dashboards displaying real data with annotations explaining what insights each visualization provided. The room had gone quiet in the focused way that suggested genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. The case study section was where I knew I'd either win them over or lose them. I walked through the Caldwell and Associates implementation in detail, explaining the initial assessment, the integration challenges, the testing process, and most importantly, the results. I showed before and after comparisons of decision-making timelines, highlighted the operational inefficiencies they'd identified and corrected, presented the cost savings they'd achieved in just the first month of operation. I had written permission from Patricia to share these specifics, and the concrete numbers made the abstract concept suddenly very real. Several people in the audience were taking notes now, and I could see others tapping on their phones, probably messaging colleagues or making notes to follow up. I moved into a live demonstration, pulling up the platform interface and walking through how a user would actually interact with it. I showed how intuitive the navigation was, how quickly someone could drill down from high-level summaries to granular details, how the system flagged anomalies and opportunities without requiring users to manually hunt for them. I'd loaded sample data that represented a fictional retail company, and I demonstrated how the platform could answer specific business questions in real time. What are our 3 highest cost items that saw demand decrease last quarter? Which sales regions are outperforming projections and what variables correlate with that success? If we needed to cut expenses by 10%, which areas would have the least impact on revenue generation? Each question got an answer within seconds, displayed in clear visualizations that told a story rather than just showing numbers. The energy in the room had shifted palpably. I could feel the attention sharpening, the calculation happening in dozens of minds about whether this solution might work for their specific situations. I wrapped up with a straightforward close, acknowledging that no platform solved every problem but arguing that the approach I'd built addressed a genuine gap in the market between inadequate and unreachable. I thanked them for their attention and opened the floor for questions. The first hand went up before I'd finished speaking, and for the next 20 minutes I fielded questions that ranged from technical architecture details to pricing models to implementation timelines. Every question felt like a test, and I answered each one as directly and honestly as I could, admitting when something was still in development rather than overpromising. One executive asked pointedly about my background, noting that I'd built this independently rather than through an established company. What gives you confidence that you can support and scale this as client numbers grow? It was a fair question and probably one others were thinking. I took a breath and answered truthfully. I'm not going to pretend I have decades of executive experience or claim that scaling won't present challenges. What I can tell you is that the platform is built with scalability as a core architectural principle, that I've already brought on additional team members and have a clear hiring plan for continued growth, and that I'm committed to delivering value rather than just chasing revenue. I'd rather have 10 clients who are genuinely successful with this platform than 50 who are underwhelmed. The platform's reputation will be built on results, and that requires me to be honest about capacity and realistic about what we can deliver. The response seemed to satisfy him, and several others nodded approvingly. A woman near the front asked about data security and regulatory compliance, which let me showcase the extensive work I'd done on encryption and access controls. Another executive asked whether the platform could integrate with specific legacy systems his company used, and I was able to speak knowledgeably about those systems and how the integration would work. The questions kept coming, each one an opportunity to demonstrate expertise and build credibility. Finally, Marcus stepped in and noted that we were well over time, though he said it with a smile that suggested being over time was a compliment. The room broke into genuine applause, not the polite courtesy clapping that happens automatically but the sustained kind that indicates real appreciation. As people filtered out for the mid-morning break, I was immediately surrounded by executives wanting to continue conversations. Business cards appeared from every direction, questions about pricing and timelines and specific use cases. I answered what I could and took contact information for follow-up discussions, my mind struggling to keep track of names and companies and who had asked about what. Patricia appeared at my elbow, gently extracting me from the crowd with the practiced skill of someone who'd done this many times. "You did beautifully," she said quietly as we moved toward a quieter corner. That was exactly the kind of substantive, credible presentation this group responds to. "I'd guess you'll have at least a dozen serious inquiries by the end of the day." She was right. By the time the event wrapped up that afternoon, I'd collected 43 business cards and had scheduled preliminary calls with 11 companies. My inbox was flooding with follow-up emails, and Rita texted that our website traffic had spiked dramatically, presumably from people looking us up during or after the presentation. The momentum was dizzying, the sudden shift from scraping for attention to fielding more interest than I could immediately handle. I drove back to the office in a daze of exhaustion and exhilaration, my phone buzzing constantly with new messages. Rita was waiting when I arrived, having monitored the influx of inquiries. She'd already categorized them by priority and drafted template responses for me to personalize. "This is insane," she said, eyes bright with excitement. "Do you realize what just happened? You basically announced yourself as a major player in the regional tech ecosystem in one presentation. People are going to be talking about this." I let myself feel the full weight of that for a moment, the validation of being taken seriously by people who had no reason to humor me or prop up my confidence. This was earned. This was real. My phone rang again, and I almost ignored it until I saw my father's name. I answered, and he immediately asked how it went. When I told him, his voice carried unmistakable pride. "I knew you could do this. I always knew." We talked for a few more minutes before he had to go, but his words settled something in me, a quiet reassurance that I'd made the right choices even when they'd been painful. The following week was a blur of phone calls and meetings, demos and negotiations, contracts being drafted and revised. I hired a second employee, a project manager named Kevin who had experience scaling software companies and could help me navigate the operational challenges of rapid growth. The office that had felt spacious 3 weeks ago now felt cramped, and I started looking at larger spaces in the same building. The problems I was solving now were the good kind of problems, the ones that came from too much success rather than not enough. But underneath the professional triumph, there was still the unresolved weight of family fracture. Vanessa's smear campaign had quieted somewhat after the Tech Alliance presentation, probably because enough people in her network had attended or heard about it that her claims of my incompetence were obviously false. But the silence felt temporary, like the pause between lightning and thunder. I didn't expect her to simply accept defeat and move on. I was right. 2 weeks after the presentation, I received a formal notice that Vanessa had filed a lawsuit. The complaint alleged exactly what her attorney had threatened: tortious interference and misappropriation, along with some additional creative claims about breach of fiduciary duty based on our familial relationship. My attorney read through it and called it a fishing expedition, an attempt to find something actionable in the hopes I'd settle to avoid the hassle. We filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that the complaint failed to state any valid legal claim, and I tried to focus on work while the legal process ground slowly forward. But the lawsuit hung over everything, a constant reminder that success came with costs I hadn't fully anticipated. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about family loyalty and personal betrayal, about whether choosing yourself over keeping peace made you selfish or strong. I didn't have clear answers to those questions. I just knew I couldn't go back to being invisible, even if visibility meant standing in the line of fire. The courthouse steps were slick with December rain when I arrived for the preliminary hearing on Vanessa's lawsuit. My attorney, a sharp woman named Catherine Morris who specialized in business litigation, met me outside with an umbrella that did little to keep the cold drizzle from soaking through my coat. She briefed me quickly on what to expect. The judge would hear arguments on our motion to dismiss. Vanessa's attorney would try to convince him there was enough substance to proceed to discovery, and we'd argue that the entire case was baseless and should be thrown out before wasting everyone's time and money. Catherine was confident but realistic. Even weak cases sometimes survived motions to dismiss if the judge wanted to let the process play out. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined from television dramas, more administrative than theatrical. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the wood paneling looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. Vanessa sat at the plaintiff's table with Derek Patterson, her posture rigid and her expression carefully neutral. She didn't look at me when I entered, keeping her gaze fixed straight ahead as if I didn't exist. Howard wasn't with her, which surprised me until I remembered that he'd moved out 3 weeks ago according to a mutual friend who'd reached out with awkward sympathy. Apparently the stress of the lawsuit combined with growing doubts about Vanessa's version of events had fractured their marriage beyond immediate repair. The judge entered, a heavy-set man in his 60s with reading glasses perched on his nose and an air of having seen every variation of human conflict that could end up in his courtroom. He scanned the filings quickly, asked a few preliminary questions to confirm everyone was present and ready, then nodded for Patterson to begin. Vanessa's attorney stood and launched into his argument with practiced confidence. He painted a picture of sisterly betrayal, of trust violated and confidences exploited. He claimed that I'd used my position as family member to gain access to Vanessa's business strategies, client lists, and proprietary marketing approaches, then deliberately undermined her relationship with her most valuable client in order to steal that business from myself. He characterized my platform as derivative of concepts Vanessa had discussed with me in family conversations, suggested that my technical knowledge was less extensive than I claimed, and argued that Patricia Caldwell had been manipulated into terminating a successful relationship based on false information I provided. The narrative was compelling if you didn't know any of the actual facts. Patterson presented it with just enough emotional appeal to make Vanessa seem like a victim of calculated cruelty while staying within the bounds of legal argument. When he finished, the judge turned to Catherine and invited her response. She stood with a folder of documents and began methodically dismantling every claim. She pointed out that the complaint contained no specific allegations of what confidential information I'd supposedly accessed or misappropriated. There were no examples of proprietary concepts I'd stolen, no evidence of any conversations where business secrets were shared, no documentation of me having access to client lists or strategic plans. The entire theory rested on the assumption that family members necessarily shared confidential business information, which wasn't just unsupported but contradicted by the reality that Vanessa and I had barely spoken about our respective work. Catherine then addressed the tortious interference claim, explaining that simply being better at your job than a competitor wasn't interference with business relationships. Patricia Caldwell had made an independent business decision based on her assessment of the services being provided by Vanessa's agency versus what my platform could offer. There was no evidence I'd made false statements about Vanessa or her agency, no proof of any improper conduct, nothing beyond the natural result of a client choosing a different provider because they believed it better served their needs. As for the claim that my technical expertise was exaggerated, Catherine produced letters from Patricia Caldwell, from Diane at Caldwell and Associates, and from 3 other companies I was now working with, all attesting to the quality and effectiveness of my work. She submitted documentation of my educational background, my work history, and the independent development of my platform, none of which involved any input from or reference to anything Vanessa had done. The judge asked several pointed questions, most of them directed at Patterson. Where specifically did the complaint allege that confidential information had been shared? Patterson fumbled through vague references to family dinners and general conversations. What evidence supported the claim that Ms. Bennett had made false statements to Patricia Caldwell? Patterson could only point to the fact that the relationship had ended shortly after we met, as if correlation proved causation. How did family relationship create a fiduciary duty that would have been breached? Patterson argued that sisters owed each other loyalty and good faith, which even I could tell was stretching legal concepts past their breaking point. After about 40 minutes of argument and questioning, the judge removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked tired and slightly irritated, as if this case was exactly the kind of waste of judicial resources that made his job frustrating. "I'm going to grant the motion to dismiss," he said flatly. "The complaint fails to state any claim upon which relief can be granted. The allegations are conclusory rather than specific, the legal theories are unsupported by applicable law, and the entire action appears to be an attempt to use the court system to resolve what is fundamentally a family dispute rather than a legitimate legal controversy." He looked directly at Vanessa for the first time. "Ms. Reeves, I understand you feel wronged by your sister's success, but hurt feelings don't constitute tortious interference. If you believe Ms. Bennett actually stole proprietary information from you, you're free to file an amended complaint with specific factual allegations that would support such a claim. But based on what's been presented today, I see no basis for this lawsuit to proceed. Dismissed with prejudice if no amended complaint is filed within 30 days. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that felt like punctuation on months of accumulated tension. Catherine squeezed my shoulder in congratulations while gathering her materials. Across the aisle, Patterson was speaking in low tones to Vanessa, whose face had gone pale and tight. I watched her stand mechanically, watched her walk toward the exit without once glancing in my direction, watched the rigid set of her shoulders that spoke of barely contained emotion. Part of me wanted to feel triumphant, vindicated, proven right in the most official way possible. But mostly I felt hollow, exhausted by the reality that it had come to this, that the relationship was so damaged that we'd ended up in a courtroom with a judge deciding who had wronged whom. Outside, Catherine walked me to my car and reviewed next steps. The dismissal with prejudice meant Vanessa couldn't refile the same claims without significant new evidence, and given how thoroughly the judge had rejected her arguments, it was unlikely she'd find an attorney willing to try. We'd file for attorney's fees since the case had been deemed frivolous, though Catherine warned me not to expect much even if we won that motion. The victory was in the dismissal itself, in having the legal system officially confirm what I'd known all along, that I'd done nothing wrong. I drove back to the office in a rain that had intensified to a steady downpour, the windshield wipers beating a rhythm that matched my pulse. My phone rang through the car's Bluetooth, my father's name appearing on the dashboard. Before I could say anything, he spoke first. "I heard. Vanessa called me from the courthouse parking lot. She was crying, barely coherent, saying that everyone had turned against her and that she'd lost everything. I didn't know what to say to her, Claire. I didn't know how to comfort her without lying about what happened." The pain in his voice was sharp enough to cut through my numbness. "She did this to herself, Dad. I know that's hard to hear, but it's true. Every choice that led to this moment was hers to make, and she chose wrong repeatedly. I can feel sorry that she's hurting without accepting responsibility for causing that hurt." He sighed heavily. "I know. I do know that. But she's still my daughter, and watching her self-destruct is one of the hardest things I've ever had to witness. I don't know how to help her, especially when she won't acknowledge that she needs help or that her perception of reality has become distorted." We talked for a few more minutes, mostly him processing his grief over the family fracture and me listening because there wasn't much else I could offer. When we hung up, I sat in the office parking lot for a long time, letting the rain drum on the roof and watching water stream down the windows. The next several weeks brought a kind of professional whirlwind that left little time for emotional processing. The interest generated by the Tech Alliance presentation had converted into actual contracts at a rate that exceeded my most optimistic projections. I hired 3 more employees, moved the company into a significantly larger office space, and found myself spending more time on management and business strategy than on actual coding. It was a strange transition, watching something I'd built alone in a garden shed transform into a real company with employees and overhead and growth projections. Rita had become my de facto second in command, managing technical implementations while I handled client relationships and strategic planning. Kevin proved invaluable in building operational systems that could scale, implementing project management protocols and financial tracking that gave me visibility into how the business was actually performing rather than just hoping everything would work out. By mid-January, we had 12 active clients, another 8 in the implementation pipeline, and a waiting list of companies wanting to start pilot programs. The revenue was real and sustainable, enough that I could finally exhale about personal finances and start thinking about long-term business strategy rather than just survival. I moved out of my father's house and into a small apartment closer to downtown, nothing fancy but mine in a way that felt significant after months of temporary existence. The independence was both liberating and lonely, coming home to empty rooms after years of shared space, cooking dinner for one and eating in silence broken only by traffic sounds from the street below. Patricia invited me to lunch again in late January, this time at an upscale steakhouse where she clearly wanted to discuss something important in a setting that conveyed the weight of the conversation. Over appetizers, she got to the point. Caldwell & Associates is growing faster than our current business model supports. We're looking at acquisition opportunities to expand our service offerings and market reach. I've been discussing with my board the possibility of acquiring your company as a wholly owned subsidiary. You'd continue running operations with significant autonomy, but you'd have the backing of our resources, our client relationships, and our infrastructure. She named a purchase price that made me nearly drop my fork, a number that represented more money than I'd imagined earning in a decade of steady work. The offer was tempting on multiple levels. Financial security, validation from someone I respected, protection from the constant pressure of having to generate new business while also delivering on existing commitments. But it also meant giving up ownership of something I'd built from nothing, surrendering control over direction and decisions, becoming an employee again rather than an independent operator. I asked for time to consider it, and Patricia agreed readily, saying the offer would remain open for 60 days and that she understood the magnitude of the decision. I spent the next week in discussions with advisors, running financial projections, talking through scenarios with Rita and Kevin about what acquisition would mean for them and for the company culture we'd been building. In the end, I decided against it. The offer was generous, and Patricia's vision for integration made strategic sense, but I wasn't ready to give up independence I'd only just claimed. I'd spent too many years being defined by other people's frameworks, fitting myself into spaces designed by someone else. This company, imperfect and precarious as it sometimes felt, was mine in a way nothing else had ever been. I could fail or succeed based on my own decisions rather than being absorbed into someone else's success story. When I told Patricia, she took it gracefully and said the door would remain open if I changed my mind. She also mentioned that turning down the acquisition had actually increased her respect for me, that knowing when to say no to easy money was a sign of someone who understood what they were really building. February brought an unexpected email from Howard. He wrote carefully, apologizing for reaching out but wanting me to know that his divorce from Vanessa was proceeding and that he'd spent considerable time reflecting on his own role in enabling her behavior. He didn't ask for forgiveness or try to excuse anything, just offered his perspective on what he'd observed and learned. The marriage had been breaking down long before the wedding, he wrote, but he'd convinced himself that love and patience would be enough to help Vanessa work through whatever drove her need for constant validation and competition. Watching her spiral after losing the Caldwell contract, seeing her become consumed with destroying me rather than rebuilding her own career, had forced him to recognize that he couldn't save someone who didn't believe they needed saving. He wished me well and said he hoped someday enough time would pass that the family might find some kind of peace, even if reconciliation seemed impossible now. I responded briefly, thanking him for his honesty and wishing him well in his own recovery from the marriage's end. I didn't have energy for managing his guilt or reassuring him about choices he'd made. But the email did make me think about Vanessa in a way I'd been avoiding, wondering what her days looked like now, whether she was working or paralyzed, whether she'd found any way to process what had happened that didn't involve blaming everyone else. My father mentioned in passing that she'd taken a job with a marketing firm in Seattle, moving away from Portland and the professional community that had witnessed her unraveling. Maybe distance would give her perspective. Maybe it would just let her nurse grievances without confrontation. Either way, it wasn't my problem to solve. Spring arrived with the kind of sudden warmth that made everyone in Portland emerge blinking into sunshine like they'd forgotten it existed. The office windows stayed open, letting in sounds of the city waking from winter dormancy. We celebrated our 1-year anniversary as an official company with a modest party in the office, nothing elaborate but enough to acknowledge how far we'd come. Rita gave a toast about believing in long shots and learning from fearless leaders, which made me uncomfortable and proud in equal measure. Kevin presented a framed article from a local business journal that had featured our company as an emerging player in the regional tech ecosystem, calling our approach innovative and our growth trajectory impressive. My father attended the party, shaking hands with employees he'd heard about but never met, asking intelligent questions about their work and making everyone feel valued in that quiet way he had. Watching him interact with the team I'd built, seeing pride evident in every gesture and word, made me realize how much of my resilience had come from having at least one person who'd never doubted my capability. He'd given me space to fail or succeed without projecting his own needs onto the outcome, and that unconditional support had been the foundation everything else was built on. Before he left, he pulled me aside and handed me a small box. Inside was my mother's wedding ring, a simple gold band I hadn't seen since her funeral. "I was going through some old things and found this," he said quietly. "I know you and Vanessa both expected she'd leave it to one of you in her will, but she never specified. I've been holding on to it, unsure what to do. But I think you should have it. Not because you're the successful one or the good daughter or any of that. Because you've become someone who understands that real value isn't in the ring itself but in what you build with your own hands." The gesture moved me more than I could articulate. My mother and I had never been close, her favoritism toward Vanessa too consistent to be accidental or unintended. But this felt like closure on that old wound, an acknowledgement that I'd built a life she might have been proud of even if she'd never said so while alive. I slipped the ring onto my right hand, where it fit perfectly, a weight I'd carry forward without resentment. That evening, alone in my apartment with the windows open to spring air, I pulled out my laptop and did something I'd been avoiding for months. I opened social media and searched for Vanessa's profile. It was still active but barely, no posts since February, no photos, no updates. The vibrant online presence she'd maintained for years had gone dark, as if she'd decided visibility was too costly when it couldn't be controlled. I typed out a message and then deleted it 3 times, unsure what I even wanted to say. Finally I settled on something simple and true. "I don't know if you'll read this or if you want to hear from me. I'm not reaching out to gloat or to demand apologies. I just wanted you to know that I hope you find your way to something that makes you happy, something that doesn't require anyone else to fail for you to succeed. We probably can't repair what's been broken between us, at least not anytime soon. But maybe someday enough time will pass that we can be in the same room without all this weight. I wish you well, Vanessa. I genuinely do." I hit send before I could reconsider, then closed the laptop and turned my attention to other things. Whether she responded didn't matter. I'd said what I needed to say, offered the only olive branch I had capacity to extend. What she did with it was beyond my control, and I was learning to be okay with that uncertainty. Summer brought new challenges and opportunities in equal measure. We landed our first contract with a national client, a healthcare system with facilities across multiple states that needed exactly the kind of integration solution we specialized in. The project was significantly larger than anything we'd tackled before, requiring us to hire additional staff and formalize processes that had been relatively informal when we were smaller. I brought on a sales director, a operations manager, and 3 more technical specialists, watching the company transform from scrappy startup to legitimate business with actual hierarchy and structure. The growth was exciting and terrifying, forcing me to develop skills I'd never needed as an independent developer, learning to delegate and trust others with work I'd previously controlled directly. The national contract also brought visibility that attracted attention from venture capital firms interested in funding our expansion. I took meetings with several of them, listening to pitches about accelerated growth and market dominance, about scaling nationally and eventually internationally. The ambition was intoxicating, the vision of building something truly significant rather than just regionally successful. But I remained cautious, remembering how easily big dreams could become other people's visions imposed on your work. I wanted to grow at a pace I could manage, building sustainably rather than chasing explosive expansion that might compromise quality or culture. Several of the VCs seemed frustrated by my hesitance, accusing me of thinking too small or lacking the hunger that separated good entrepreneurs from great ones. Maybe they were right. Or maybe I'd learned that success on someone else's timeline wasn't actually success at all. By August, the company had 23 employees and revenue projections that exceeded anything I'd imagined when sketching ideas in that garden shed. We'd outgrown our office space again and were negotiating a lease on an entire floor of a building near the waterfront, room to expand into as the team continued growing. Rita had been promoted to Chief Technology Officer, Kevin to Chief Operating Officer, and I'd taken on the CEO title with some reluctance, still uncomfortable with the formality and hierarchy it implied. But the structure was necessary as we scaled, creating clear lines of authority and responsibility that kept things running smoothly even when I wasn't directly involved in every decision. In September, I received an invitation to speak at a national tech conference in San Francisco, one of the major industry events that drew thousands of attendees and significant media coverage. The topic was building sustainable tech businesses outside traditional startup hubs, focusing on how regional ecosystems could support innovation without requiring everyone to move to Silicon Valley. I accepted the invitation, recognizing it as an opportunity to establish presence on a national stage rather than just regional relevance. The preparation was intense, requiring me to articulate lessons learned and insights gained from the past year in ways that would resonate with an audience far beyond Portland's tech community. The night before the conference, I sat in a San Francisco hotel room reviewing my slides and feeling the familiar anxiety that preceded public speaking. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me check. The message was short. "I saw you're speaking tomorrow. I'll be in the audience. Wanted you to know so it wouldn't be a surprise. Good luck." It was from Vanessa. My first instinct was panic, imagining disruption or confrontation in front of hundreds of people. But as I read the message again, I noticed something unexpected. There was no hostility in it, no veiled threat or passive-aggressive subtext. Just information, offered straightforwardly, and a genuine seeming wish for my success. I typed back carefully. "Thank you for letting me know. I hope you're doing well." Her response came quickly. "Getting there. Slowly. Working on myself and trying to figure out who I am when I'm not competing with everyone. It's harder than I expected." Then, after a pause, another message. "I'm proud of what you've built, Claire. I should have said that a long time ago. I'm sorry I didn't. I'm sorry for a lot of things." The apology landed with unexpected weight, years of hurt and anger suddenly confronted with something I'd stopped believing would ever come. I didn't know how to respond, whether to accept it immediately or maintain distance or demand more specific acknowledgments of harm done. In the end, I kept it simple. "Thank you for saying that. It means more than you probably know. We have a long way to go, but maybe this is a start." She sent back a simple heart emoji, and then silence. I set the phone down and returned to my slides, but my focus had shifted. Tomorrow I'd stand on that stage not just as a successful entrepreneur but as someone who'd survived family fracture and professional sabotage and self-doubt deep enough to nearly swallow me whole. The story I'd tell wouldn't include those details, wouldn't air personal pain for public consumption. But knowing they were part of the foundation made the achievement feel more substantial, more earned. The conference presentation went better than I'd hoped. The audience was engaged, the questions thoughtful, and the response afterward overwhelming. I fielded inquiries from potential clients, from journalists wanting to feature the company, from other entrepreneurs seeking advice or mentorship. And somewhere in that crowd of hundreds, Vanessa listened and watched and maybe began to understand that my success had never been about diminishing her, just about finally refusing to diminish myself. We didn't speak afterward, didn't seek each other out for a dramatic reconciliation scene. The healing, if it happened at all, would be gradual and private, built through consistent small actions rather than grand gestures. But knowing she'd been there, that she'd chosen to witness my success rather than avoid it, felt like progress. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet. But maybe the beginning of something that could eventually become peace. Flying home to Portland, watching the city appear below as we descended through clouds, I thought about the past year and everything that had transformed. I'd gone from unemployed and dismissed to CEO of a growing company. From invisible to visible, from accommodation to assertion, from apology to ownership. The cost had been high, relationships fractured and family divided in ways that might never fully heal. But the alternative had been higher, a lifetime of making myself smaller to preserve a peace that was really just silence. I'd chosen visibility and all its complications, and I was learning to live with both the rewards and the consequences. The plane touched down smoothly, and I gathered my things with the practiced efficiency of someone who traveled regularly now. There was work waiting, decisions to make, a company to run. But there was also stability, autonomy, and the quiet satisfaction of having built something valuable that no one could take away or diminish. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The November afternoon carried that particular quality of light that only happens in the Pacific Northwest, golden and slanting through rain clouds that had finally cleared. I stood at the window of our expanded office space, watching the city spread out below while behind me the team worked through the usual Friday afternoon rhythm of wrapping up projects and planning for the weekend. My phone buzzed with a notification, an email from the organizers of next month's Tech Innovation Summit asking if I'd be interested in serving on a panel about women in technology leadership. I added it to my calendar without the hesitation that would have paralyzed me a year ago. Rita appeared at my office door with a printout of our quarterly numbers, her expression carrying that mix of disbelief and satisfaction that never quite faded no matter how consistent our growth became. "We're up 38% from last quarter," she said, setting the report on my desk. "Kevin thinks we'll need to start turning away clients soon unless we want to expand faster than feels sustainable." It was a good problem to have, the kind that meant we'd built something people genuinely valued. We spent 20 minutes discussing hiring plans and capacity management, the practical challenges of success that required constant attention and adjustment. After Rita left, I picked up my phone and scrolled through messages until I found the thread with Vanessa. We'd been texting sporadically since the San Francisco conference, nothing deep or revelatory, just occasional check-ins that maintained connection without demanding resolution. Her latest message from 2 days ago mentioned that her Seattle marketing firm had promoted her to senior strategist, a position she'd earned through solid work rather than political maneuvering. I typed out a quick congratulations, genuine and warm, then hesitated before adding that I'd be visiting Dad for Thanksgiving and she was welcome to join if she wanted. No pressure, just an open invitation if she felt ready. Her response came faster than I expected. "I'd like that. I think I'm ready to try. Maybe we can't fix everything that's broken, but I want to at least stop breaking new things." I showed the message to my father that evening over dinner at his house, the same kitchen table where so many complicated conversations had unfolded. He read it carefully, then looked up with eyes that carried cautious hope. "You sure you're ready for that? Having her there might stir up things you've put to rest." I considered the question honestly. I didn't know if I was ready, but I knew I was willing to find out. That felt like enough. Thanksgiving arrived with unseasonably warm weather and clear skies, the kind of day that felt like a gift after weeks of rain. I arrived at my father's house early to help with cooking, finding comfort in the familiar rituals of peeling potatoes and setting the table. Vanessa's car pulled into the driveway around 2, and I watched through the window as she sat for a long moment before getting out, gathering courage for whatever came next. When she walked through the door, I saw someone different from the person who'd raged at her wedding reception. She looked smaller somehow, less armored, carrying a store-bought pie and an uncertain smile. We embraced awkwardly, the kind of hug that acknowledged distance while attempting bridge building. Dad ushered us both into the kitchen, immediately putting us to work on tasks that required cooperation, his gentle way of forcing interaction without demanding conversation. We moved around each other carefully at first, too polite, too conscious of the weight between us. But gradually, as the afternoon wore on and the meal came together, something loosened. We fell into old patterns of kitchen coordination, the muscle memory of countless family dinners overriding the recent history of hurt. Over dinner, we talked about safe topics at first, work and weather and mutual acquaintances, carefully avoiding anything that might detonate the fragile peace. But eventually, after the plates were cleared and we'd moved to the living room with coffee, Vanessa spoke into a comfortable silence. "I've been seeing a therapist. Started right after I moved to Seattle." She looked down at her cup, fingers tracing the rim. "I'm learning a lot about myself, and honestly most of it hasn't been comfortable. Understanding why I needed to win so badly that I'd destroy relationships to do it. Recognizing how much of my identity was built on comparison rather than actual values. It's hard work, facing that stuff. I appreciated the vulnerability, the willingness to name difficult truths without expecting immediate absolution. We're all carrying things that shaped us in ways we didn't choose," I said carefully. "The question is what we do once we recognize the patterns." Vanessa nodded, meeting my eyes directly for the first time that day. "I can't undo what I did. The lawsuit, the social media campaign, trying to sabotage your meeting with Patricia, all of it. I was so threatened by your success that I couldn't see how deeply I was damaging myself and everyone around me. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, maybe not ever. But I needed you to know that I understand what I did, and I'm genuinely sorry for all of it." The apology was more specific and accountable than her text message had been, and I felt something shift in response to it. "I can't promise we'll get back to being close," I said honestly. "Too much has happened, and trust takes time to rebuild. But I can promise I'll try to move forward rather than staying stuck in anger. That feels like the best either of us can do right now." She accepted that with visible relief, and we spent the rest of the evening in easier conversation, sharing stories about our work without competition, laughing at Dad's terrible jokes, existing in the same space without the constant undercurrent of tension. When I drove home that night, I felt lighter than I had in months, not because everything was fixed but because forward movement felt possible again. The business would continue growing, challenges would arise and require solving, and life would unfold with all its complications. But I'd proven to myself that I could survive the worst someone could throw at me and come out stronger rather than broken. That knowledge changed everything, not just professionally but in every aspect of how I moved through the world. The office Monday morning buzzed with post-holiday energy, everyone comparing stories and easing back into work rhythms. I gathered the leadership team to discuss year-end planning and strategy for the coming months. We had decisions to make about expansion, about whether to pursue more venture capital or maintain our current sustainable growth trajectory, about what kind of company we wanted to build beyond just successful. The conversation was thoughtful and energizing, everyone contributing perspectives that made the collective thinking stronger than any individual vision. Later that week, I received an email from a graduate student researching women who'd built successful tech companies outside traditional startup ecosystems. She wanted to interview me about my journey, the obstacles I'd faced and strategies I'd employed. Reading through her questions, I realized how much of the story I'd been reluctant to tell, not from shame but from not wanting to be defined by struggle rather than achievement. But maybe both mattered, maybe the obstacles were part of what made the achievement meaningful. I agreed to the interview and spent an hour on the phone sharing my experience with honesty that surprised me, talking about the miscarriage and the career sabotage and the family fracture alongside the technical innovations and business growth. The student asked what advice I'd give to other women facing similar challenges, people who felt trapped between staying small to keep peace and risking everything to claim their own space. I thought about that garden shed and the cold pizza and the moment Charles had stood up from his wheelchair, about all the small decisions that had led to this moment. My answer came clearly. Stop waiting for permission to be as capable as you actually are. Stop making yourself invisible so other people can shine brighter. The cost of visibility might be high, but the cost of lifelong invisibility is higher. And when people try to diminish you for succeeding, remember that their discomfort says more about them than about you. Build something you believe in, build it well, and let the work speak louder than anyone's opinion about whether you deserve to do it. The interview ended, and I returned to the day's tasks with renewed clarity about what I'd built and why it mattered. This wasn't just a company or a career or a professional achievement. It was proof that the version of yourself other people need you to be doesn't have to be the version you actually are. It was evidence that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply refuse to shrink. And it was a foundation for whatever came next, built on solid ground rather than borrowed confidence or others' approval. The autumn sun streamed through the office windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the light, and I felt profoundly grateful for every difficult choice that had led here, every moment of doubt I'd pushed through, every time I'd chosen myself when it would have been easier not to. This was my life, messy and complicated and hard-won and entirely mine. And that was more than enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.